Good afternoon to everybody, and I thank you, the organizer of the webinar, Ida and Marianna, for this stimulating colloquium. And I start immediately with my talk. The first part, I will introduce the theme of motherhood in Sicilian coroplasty and in the century of Bitalemi at Gela. The topic of motherhood and early childhood in Greek world has been the focus of many studies in recent years, especially from an anthropological perspective, and that refrain us to resume this important issue. With regard to Sicily specifically, an historian of religion, Giulia Pedrucci, will speak later, collected a good documentary base, which especially includes the clay figurines found in the many centers of the islands. In the work of the scholar, the archaeological documentation is also used to review the hypothesis on the particular veneration paid here towards the chthonic deities in favor of local divinities with an accentuated maternal value. But the purpose of our contribution today, however, is to focus on the iconographic type depicting a mother with a child and on the significance of the gesture of the offering, regardless of the identification with the divinity who receives it. Through the dedication of their terracotta substitute, in fact, the brides saw the divine protection during the delicate phase of pregnancy or in the preliminary ones, or else celebrated the divine intervention following a successful delivery and the full survival of the newborn. The analysis will be conducted starting from a very specific context, such as that of the century of Bitalemi in Gela. The clay offerings, like all the rest of the objects chosen and dedicated in a sacred area, must in fact be understood in its specifically dedicatory context. And now a few words on the century. The sacred area located on the sandy hill of Bitalemi, already investigated by Paolo Orsi and extensively by Orlandini in the 60s, is widely known. The number of finds, the excellent state of preservation, especially of the materials from the archaic level of attendance, and the particularity of some votive deposition have stimulated the interest of scholars. The discovery of some graffiti from the classical period that name Demeter and the festival that was celebrated here, the Thesmophoria, also led to reassure identification of the cult practice in the century, confirmed by the exhaustive study just published. The attendance of the sacred area began in the last quarter of the 7th century BC. The building of modest mud brick structures date back to this first phase. Around the middle of the 5th century BC, more significant structures of sandstone blocks, also intended to provide shelter for the worshippers, were erected to replace 3 idol buildings, of which some walls remains. After the Carthaginian destruction of 405 BC, the area continued to be occasionally frequented during the 3rd century BC before being occupied by a farm in the imperial era and subsequently by a small church consecrated to the Virgin of Bethlehem in the Middle Ages. And now let's go to the figurines. The figurines of mother with children found in the excavation by Orsi and Orlandini are divided into main groups, those standing with a child on their shoulder and those sitting or standing with a child on their lap. Within the two groupings, variants are then distinguished. The most frequent attested group is that of standing figurines wearing a chiton, which support a child seated on the left shoulder. It is made up of 11 specimens, mainly fragmentary. Recognition of the entire representation is only possible thanks to some of these, which show how the child, whose nudity is defined, who is connected as a boy, clings to the mother's head with his right hand. Only in a figurine found by Orsi does the child rest his head on that of his mother, as if he were asleep. The type of the female figurine with another small figure on the left shoulder is found elsewhere, both in the coroplastic repertoire of Greece in the classical and early Hellenistic period and in other Sicilian contexts, although not very widespread. In the other known case from Sicily, however, the figure is rather small and does not rest on this mother head. In specimen from Greece, the mother mostly holds her right arm raised to hold the baby on her shoulder. Instead, in the figurines of our century, the detail of the arm that holds the mother is explicitly emphasized together with the nudity of the child. Even its size, larger than the other known types, seems to confirm the emphasis on the message to be transmitted, where the courotrophic aspect stands out clearly. It should be noted that the type is a local creation, as denounced by the treatment of the dress, identical to that of some figurines of offers with piglets, very common in the Gela repertoire, as well as that of the mother's hair, loose on the shoulders. In the century, there is also a fragmentary specimen belonging to the type only known from a figurine from Randazzo. In addition to the importance of the circulation of this iconographic type, which shows a stylistic link with the Locrian area and does not find comparison either for clothing or dressing between the numerous types of offers widespread in Gela, it is important to remember that it does not seem to be associated to the kourotrophos terracottas to cour, because a female figurine on the shoulder who is wearing a peplum is perhaps better interpreted as a divine image carried in procession. In the second group of figurines, we must distinguish between the standing figures who carry the child in their arms and those seated who hold it in their lap. The standing figures are 6, wearing chiton and himation and holding a child on the left side with both arms, partially wrapped in a flap of the cloak. Two very similar figurines occur among the materials of the Santuario Poggio dell'Aquila near Gran Michele. The child is represented with very short hair and looks like a newborn. The iconographic type, also present in the Rhodian repertoire, although not common, finds some comparison in Magna Graecia too. Only one figurine from the Orsi excavation belongs to a different type. The woman wraps a small child in the heavy cloak on the left side of her body. Among the seated figures, however, 3 different types are distinguished. The first depicts a female figure seated on a diffusion with a child in her lap, depicted frontally, holding a small patera or a tambourine in his hand. 4 fragmentary figurines belong to this iconographic type. Similar images of seated female figures are frequent in the coroplastic repertoire from Greece and frequently occur in Sicilian context for a long period of time. For example, more ancient similar types come from Camarina, Selinus, and Montebubonia. But here the child holds his arm raised without any attributes. The type continues to be reproduced even in the 4th century BC with figurines where the mother holds out her right breast to the child, as shown by a terracotta from Selinus. In the wide range of variants found in Greece, the baby is poorly defined and generally depicted in the act of taking his mother's milk. Once again, the Gelaon figures belong to a local variant, where the choroplast has added an attribute in the child's hand. The only close comparison coming from a couple of figurines found in the city Acropolis that you see here in the slide. 3 seated figurines, poorly preserved, all the child depicted in profile, perhaps in the act of taking milk from his mother's breast. The clothing of figurines with chiton and himation that cover the heads belong to the repertoire of late archaic tradition. The baby, who appears to be wearing a headdress, was clearly added in a later time as an attribute from a female type. Lastly, Completely different from the other one, and certainly more recent, there is a figurine seated on a diffusion holding an infant in her lap, wrapped in swaddling cloth and larger than life size. The mother wears her hair styled in the Lampadion knot, according to a common fashion among Artemis representation and which characterize the youth sphere. Again, the attribute of the newborn was added to a female type, to a seated female type already attested in Gela. Now let's go to dating and interpretation. From a chronological point of view, it's not easy to distinguish the variants of the iconographic type accurately, especially because of the fragmentary nature of the pieces. Even the discovery data does not offer any holds. The figurines were in fact largely recovered during cleaning or in layers remixed by illegal excavation. The only mention in Orlandini excavation journal is the reference to the free wall figurines found during the excavation of Building 2, used throughout the second half of the 5th century BC and probably belonging to the nucleus of material deposited inside it. The dating must therefore be entrusted to stylistic criteria, which seem to define a fairly long time span of diffusion. If the sitting type with baby at the breast still belongs to model widespread at the end of the 6th century BC, the clothing of standing figurines with a child on their shoulder can easily be compared to that of some offerers with piglets and therefore suggest a more detailed period of diffusion around the middle of the 5th century BC. The seated figurines with a child holding a small patera or a tambourine have been created later. Identical specimens from the Acropolis that we have seen before have been dated to the end of the 5th century. The standing figurines with a newborn wrapped in the cloak have a shorter style similar to that of the so-called bobo found on the Acropolis of the city, dated at the end of the century as well. Even the isolated type with a swaddled infant can be dated in the last decade of the 5th century BC, as indicated by both the hairstyle of the mother and the representation of a newborn in swaddling cloth, however poorly attested in the insular repertoire. We see here a specimen from Morgantina. From a typological point of view, it is interesting to underline how all the types we have distinguished and which testify to a certain variety in the figurative repertoire find very few comparisons outside of Gela. In fact, these are mostly locally made variations of the theme, inspired by models widespread in other areas of the Sicilian and Greek world. In this regard, it is not far-fetched to wonder whether the different ways of holding and representing the child do not have a precise semantic value, that is to say, alluding to the desire to depict different age groups, underlined by the attention to detail, such as position, hairstyle, sex, and in some cases, the presence of an attribute. If the swaddled child held by the seated figurine is certainly a newborn, and slightly older must be the child held tied to the chest and protected by his mother cloak, the broader number of representation concern the child sitting on the shoulder that appears as a boy of a couple of years. The child nestled in the lap, playing with the patera or the tambourine can be included in the same age group too. After all, it is well known that in the Greek world, isolated clay representation, more than other visual support, adopt a communicative system strongly based on the symbolic sphere, where the elements that make up the image must be carefully evaluated to understand the message they wanted to convey. The reworking of iconographic types already known with the addition or replacement of a significant element such as the presence of the child itself is therefore a clue not only to the desire of the workshop to vary the repertoire in economy, but also to the request of the client who wanted to highlight a very specific aspect connected to the vow expressed. And now let's go to final remarks. Despite the fact that the materials from other rich insular sacred contests are largely known only from preliminary publications, the number of specimens from the Bitalemi century that we have seen, consisting of about 30 fragmentary figurines, still appears higher than that of the isolated find from these areas. The fact is not surprising, as the theme of fertility is traditionally subject to the protection of Demeter Thesmophoros. However, it has been used to connect the theme of motherhood in an exclusive way to the demetriac cult, certainly practiced in the century, applying the same interpretation to the other discovery context. For some scholars, moreover, the image of the mother with child could be identified with Demeter carrying her daughter Core on her shoulder. The archaeological cult study of recent years, however, have finally allowed to diversify the almost exclusive attribution of Sicilian sacred areas to the demetriac cult. Moreover, it has been underlined that the protection of the courotrophic sphere characterized various female deities of the Greek pantheon, such as Hera, Artemis, as well as Demeter, in addition to those belonging to the non-Greek substratum, like Petrucci thinks. The presence of this representation, therefore, alluding to the request for divine protection during delivery and the early childhood of newborn, is certainly appropriate in different cultural contexts, even if referable to tangent spheres of influence. Coming back to Bitalemi, it should, however, be emphasized that the iconographic type of the mother with child is definitely marginal within the repertoire of 5th century terracottas dedicated in the century, despite the wide chronological span of diffusion. This observation is particularly evident in relation to the numbers of donors with piglets and protomai, which represent almost all the bulk of the late archaic and classical terracotta types. The theme, moreover, obtains very limited success even among the figurine types known from Greece in the same period. It is therefore possible to conclude that kourotrophia motif was not a favorite subject in the figurative repertoire of Greek terracottas before the Hellenistic era. It was most easily represented in an allusive way through the apotropaic images of pot-bellied demons or animals such as monkeys carrying a baby on their shoulder. Besides, it has been widely noted that the act of breastfeeding a newborn is sparsely represented in the Greek artistic media up to the Hellenistic age, according to a widespread tendency to avoid making explicit references to a domestic and private sphere, and usually reserved for nurses. The topic, moreover, has been deeply explored by Petrucci and is exempt us from going back. Similarly, we have suggested elsewhere that a sort of iconographic taboo that originates in sacred laws could explain the limited number of representations relating to the delicate moments of pregnancy. Women in this state, vulnerable and contaminated, were in fact banned from community festive celebrations, and ritual action had to be mainly conducted within the household. We can attribute the same interpretation to the rarity of clay representation of swaddled infants, a practice limited to the first 40-60 days of life, according to the few literary testimonies, although there's no full agreement between the scholars on these dates. It is far preferable to portray the child at a later stage of its development, when it could have greater chances of survival. In conclusion, the brief review conducted on the images of mother with children from Bitalemi offers further confirmation of a trend already highlighted. Greek ritual customs define a sort of buffer zone around a phase as important as that of the delivery and the survival of the newborn. Thus, they constitute a precious lens for observing the wishes of the sanctuary visitors and the thanksgivings addressed to Demeter postpartum, when danger and pollution associated with pregnancies were over. Thank you.